Exhibit 12B. Video dated March 18th. Judge Harmon's voice echoed through the courtroom as the lights dimmed slightly. A screen lowered behind the witness stand, and my mother's face filled the empty space, her blue eyes clouded by dementia, yet still recognizable, still her. I felt Christopher's hand gently squeeze my arm, a silent reminder to breathe. Across the aisle, my brother Lucas squirmed in his seat, whispering furiously to his lawyer. On the screen, Mom appeared seated in her favorite armchair, the afternoon light casting a soft glow on her profile. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice trembling. "At home, Mom," my voice replied from behind the camera. "In the living room." "This isn't my home," she insisted, glancing around in confusion. "Where's Robert?" "Dad passed away 8 years ago, Mom. Remember?" Her face crumbled, the pain of loss fresh all over again. "Of course. I'm sorry. I forget sometimes." The video continued for several minutes, Mom mistaking me for her long-deceased sister, forgetting she had just eaten lunch, asking repeatedly what day it was. And then came the moment that changed everything. "Julia," she suddenly said, a flicker of clarity in her eyes, "you're going to get the house when I'm gone. I promised your father I'd take care of you, and you've taken such good care of me." A brief exchange followed, her words clear and deliberate. "Lucas has the apartment we helped him buy. He was never good with money, always needed more, but you built your own path. The house is your promise." The date in the corner of the screen showed exactly 1 day after she had supposedly signed the will that disinherited me. The courtroom was completely silent. And then, like distant thunder, I heard my brother's lawyer whisper, "When the hell did she record this?" It was only in that moment, watching Lucas's pale face, that I realized I had won, and also lost, in ways no court could ever repair. But that was the end of the story, the trial, the bittersweet victory. The beginning, the true beginning, happened. On an ordinary Tuesday, 8 months earlier, when the world I knew crumbled with a single phone call. "Miss Winters? This is Patricia, your mother's neighbor. I'm so sorry, dear, but I think you need to come. Your mother is gone." I was in the middle of a shift at St. Margaret's Children's Hospital, preparing medication for one of my patients, little 7-year-old Zoe, when my phone buzzed. I answered it without much thought, cradling it between my shoulder and ear while double-checking dosages. But then Patricia's words hit me like a physical blow. I dropped the syringe in my hand. Everything around me seemed to slow down, as if I were submerged in deep water. "She passed in her sleep," Patricia's voice continued, distant, like it was coming from another world. "Very peacefully, dear. I was with her." A nurse, Kim, my friend for years, noticed my expression and rushed to my side, taking the phone and listening to the rest of the details while I sank into the nearest chair, unable to process what was happening. Mom had been stable the past week. We had even celebrated her 68th birthday 3 days earlier with a small lemon cake. She had been confused, yes, but physically well, or so I thought. "She had a good day yesterday," Kim told me, repeating Patricia's words as she led me to the break room. Recognized everyone, laughed, even asked for her favorite cake again. She fell asleep watching one of those cooking shows you both loved, and just didn't wake up. The next hours were a blur of phone calls, arrangements, awkward hugs from coworkers unsure what to say. I prepared to leave the hospital, automatically initiating the family emergency protocol I had used only once before, when Dad died. I drove home, my mother's house, really, where I'd been living for the past 5 years since her dementia. Diagnosis had made it impossible to leave her alone. The familiar 22-minute drive felt both endless and strangely short at the same time. As I approached the light blue bungalow where I'd grown up, I noticed the police car parked out front. Standard. Procedure for at-home deaths. I parked haphazardly and rushed inside. Patricia was in the kitchen, making tea with trembling hands. When she saw me, she simply opened her arms. I collapsed into them like a child, though at 34, I was too tall to fit neatly against her shoulder, the way I used to. She looked so peaceful, dear, Patricia whispered into my hair, like she was just dreaming. The officer, a young man with a gentle expression, explained the necessary procedures. The doctor had already confirmed the death. Since there was nothing suspicious, and Mom had been under palliative care due to advanced dementia, the body would be released directly to the funeral home of my choice. I already called Lucas, Patricia said, referring to my older brother. He said he's on his way. I nodded mechanically. Lucas. Of course, my brother who lived just 2 hours away, yet had managed to visit our mother exactly 8 times during her 5 years of illness. I walked into Mom's bedroom, needing to see her one last time. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile than just a few hours earlier when I'd left for work. Her gray hair framed her peaceful face. The TV was still on, muted, showing some kind of cooking show. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding her now cold hand. Rest. Now, Mom, I whispered. You fought for so long. It was only then that I noticed the shoebox partially hidden under the bed, the one where we kept the trinkets she would occasionally collect during her confused episodes. Lately, she had developed a habit of hiding small objects, thinking someone was going to steal them. I reached down to grab it, and that's when I saw the envelope. White, plain, with a single word written on the front in shaky handwriting. Julia. Inside was a simple birthday card and a handwritten message, clearly written during one of her lucid moments. Dear Julia, if you're reading this, I've probably already passed. I want you to know that I understand the sacrifices you made for me. You gave up the day shift you loved, postponed that specialization you wanted to pursue, and put your life on hold for mine. The house is your promise, just like we always talked about. Everything is arranged with Mr. Phillips. Don't let your brother convince you otherwise. Lucas has always been charming, but you've always been my rock. With eternal love, Mom. The letter was dated just 3 weeks ago. I instinctively slipped the card into my pocket when I heard the front door open and Lucas's voice fill the silent space. Where is she? He asked, without even a hello to me or Patricia, and that's how it began. The end of a life and the start of a battle I never could have imagined. Lucas stormed into the room like a gust of wind. His eyes red but dry, wearing a pristine suit that felt oddly formal for someone who had just been told his mother had died. Oh, Mom, he sighed at the sight of her body, placing a hand briefly on her shoulder. Then, almost immediately, Julia, we need to talk about arrangements. And her documents, where are they kept? I was momentarily stunned by how quickly he moved from mourning to logistics. The card in my pocket felt like it was burning against my skin. Lucas, she just passed, I replied, disbelief clear in my voice. Can we maybe take a few minutes to process that? He ran a hand through his perfectly trimmed hair, a gesture of impatience I recognized from our childhood. I'm being practical, Julia. There are decisions to make, forms to fill. Her will, is it in the study? I don't know, I answered honestly. Mom never really discussed it with me in detail. She only mentioned that Mr. Phillips was handling everything. A flicker of something, relief, crossed Lucas's face. Good. Yes, Edward Phillips, her attorney. I'll contact him right away. Patricia appeared in the doorway, 2 cups of tea in her wrinkled hands. I thought you might need these, she offered gently, handing us the drinks. Her presence was a quiet reminder of normalcy amid the chaos. Lucas took the tea distractedly, then checked his watch. The funeral services. Do you have a preference for a specific funeral home? The next few hours unfolded like a surreal exercise in death logistics. Lucas took control of everything, calls to the funeral home, paperwork, obituary discussions. At one point, he disappeared into Mom's office for nearly an hour, alone. That night, after Lucas left for a nearby hotel, politely declining my mechanical offer to use the guest room, I sat on the porch with Patricia. The Minnesota dusk painted, the sky in shades of lavender and gold, the air heavy with the scent of the petunias Mom had loved so much. He didn't ask even once how she was in her final days, I observed, the realization crystallizing as I said it. Whether she suffered, whether she said anything. Patricia squeezed my hand. Some people cope with grief by focusing on tasks, sweetheart. It's not grief, I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. It's control. Patricia remained silent for a moment, clearly considering her words. Finally, are you going to show him the card? I pulled the envelope from my pocket, my fingers tracing Mom's shaky handwriting. I don't know. She seemed so sure about the house, but he's acting like he already knows something I don't. Betty and I talked a lot over the years, Patricia said cautiously. In recent months, when you were at work, she'd sometimes get confused about things. Lucas visited a few times when you weren't here. Always brief, always with papers. A chill ran down my spine. What kind of papers? I can't say for sure. My eyesight isn't what it used to be. She hesitated. But once, maybe 6 or 7 months ago, I overheard them arguing. Betty sounded upset. Lucas kept insisting she had promised something. The funeral was held 3 days later, a simple ceremony at the small Methodist church Mom had attended before she got sick. The sanctuary was surprisingly full. Former teaching colleagues, neighbors, even some of her past students, now grown with families of their own. Lucas gave a brief, eloquent, and appropriately emotional tribute, speaking about Mom's dedication to teaching and her strength as a single mother after our father's untimely death. He didn't mention her illness, her final years, or my role in caring for her. My nephew Bobby stayed by my side throughout the entire ceremony, his small hand gripping mine like an anchor. At 9 years old, he was remarkably perceptive, and even though Lucas and Angela had been divorced for 3 years, Bobby still represented my only real connection to my brother's side of the family. Aunt Julia, he whispered during one of the hymns, did Grandma know she was going to heaven? The question caught me off guard, unexpected tears stinging my eyes. I think she did, Bobby. Toward the end, she talked a lot about seeing Grandpa again. He nodded solemnly. She told me to take care of you when she left, because you always took care of everyone else. I had to bite my lip to keep from openly sobbing. Angela, seated on Bobby's other side, met my gaze and offered a small, compassionate smile. Our relationship had always been civil for Bobby's sake, but in that moment, I felt a wave of gratitude for her presence. Lucas definitely noticed our small exchange, his eyes narrowing briefly before turning his attention back to the floral arrangements he had chosen. Elaborate and expensive, completely different from the simple daisies our mother had always preferred. It was a week after the funeral when reality finally crashed into me like a cold wave. Mr. Phillips, a bland, balding man with perpetually worried eyes, welcomed us into his office for the official reading of the will. Lucas arrived accompanied by a woman I had never seen before. Tiffany, he introduced her casually, my partner. She looked uncomfortable, clearly unsure why she was even there. Before we begin, Mr. Phillips said, nervously adjusting his glasses, I should inform you that this is the most recent version of Mrs. Winter's will, properly signed and witnessed approximately 8 months ago. 8 months. The time echoed in my mind. 8 months ago, Mom was already deeply affected by dementia, with only rare moments of clarity. I'll proceed with the reading, he continued, opening a brown folder. The will began with standard formalities, the legal language thick and impenetrable. Then came the actual provisions, and the world seemed to slow around me. I leave all of my property, assets, and belongings to my son, Lucas Winters. I blinked, certain I had misheard. This includes my residence at 247 Lakeside Drive, all bank accounts, investments, and personal items contained within the property. Mr. Phillips paused, glancing briefly at me before continuing. To my daughter, Julia Winters, I leave no material assets. She is self-sufficient and capable, whereas her brother Lucas has always needed more support. I trust she will understand this decision. The silence that followed felt thick, tangible. I felt as if someone had removed all the oxygen from the room. This can't be right, I finally managed to say. My mother wasn't mentally competent to change her will 8 months ago. Mr. Phillips looked genuinely uncomfortable. Mrs. Winters was lucid when she signed this document. I personally assessed her mental state before proceeding. That's impossible, I insisted, anger beginning to replace the shock. She had advanced dementia. Some days she didn't even recognize her own house. Lucas spoke up gently, his voice the epitome of reason. Julia, we know Mom had good days and bad days. On that day, she was perfectly clear about her intentions. Something in his tone, the false sympathy, the rehearsed certainty, set off an alarm in my mind. Were you with her on the day she signed it? I asked Mr. Phillips directly. The lawyer nodded, looking more uncomfortable by the second. Yes, I went to her residence for the signing. Mr. Winters was present as a witness. Was anyone else there? Another independent witness? No, Phillips admitted. It wasn't strictly necessary since I served as the official witness. I shook my head, incredulous. Dr. Torres documented that my mother wasn't mentally capable of making legal decisions for at least 2 years. I have medical reports to prove it. Lucas gave a sad smile, like he was talking to a stubborn child. Julia, you're being irrational because you're grieving. Mom made her decision. She knew I needed more help starting over after the divorce. I could still feel the card in my pocket, like a talisman. Mom's shaky handwriting. The house is your promise. It's all arranged with Mr. Phillips. But clearly nothing had been arranged. Either someone had lied to my mother, or something far more sinister had happened. By the way, Julia, Lucas added, as casually as mentioning the weather, I'll need you to vacate the house within the next 2 weeks. Tiffany and I are planning to move in. The housing market is hot right now, and we've got some renovations in mind. That was the moment I knew I'd have to fight. Not for the house itself, or the money, but for the truth, and for my mother's real final wish. Outside Mr. Phillips' office, with Lucas's words still echoing in my head, I stopped on the sidewalk and took a deep breath of Minnesota's cold air. Patricia, who had patiently waited for me in the car, rolled down the window when she saw me. Judging by your face, it wasn't good news, she said, as I got in the vehicle. I told her everything, my voice wavering between disbelief and fury. By the time I finished, Patricia looked as pale as I felt. That's impossible, she said, echoing my own initial reaction. Betty barely knew what day it was 8 months ago. Half the time she thought I was you. Somehow Lucas convinced her to sign a new will, or maybe... I hesitated, reluctant to voice the growing suspicion. Maybe she didn't even know what she was signing. Patricia fell silent for a moment, rummaging through her purse until she pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. I kept track of Lucas's visits these past few years. Habit. I was a secretary for 4 decades, you know. She flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for. Here, he visited on March 16th, exactly 8 months and 1 week ago. Brought a man in a suit. I assumed it was Mr. Phillips. I was with Betty that morning, and I can assure you it was one of her worst days. She kept calling me Mom and insisted she had to get ready to teach classes, even though she'd been retired for a decade. My heart started to race. Were you there when they arrived? No. Lucas asked me to leave, said he wanted to spend quality time with his mother. I thought it was odd at the time, since his visits usually lasted less than 30 minutes. I went out to run errands, and when I got back 2 hours later, they were gone. I pulled the card from my pocket and reread my mother's words. It's all arranged with Mr. Phillips. Something doesn't add up, I murmured. Why would she write that if she had just signed a will leaving everything to Lucas? Maybe. Maybe she didn't know what she was signing, Patricia said softly, voicing what I feared. Or maybe she signed it under pressure and later regretted it when she had a moment of clarity. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table of the house that apparently wasn't mine anymore, surrounded by photo albums and documents. One of them was Mom's previous will, written right after Dad died, splitting everything equally between Lucas and me. Another was a folder containing all my notes about her condition over the years, dates of medical appointments, medications, episodes of confusion, good days, and bad. Something about Mr. Phillips's statement kept bothering me. I personally verified her mental state. How? What kind of test could a lawyer with no medical training possibly use that would outweigh the diagnosis of a specialized neurologist like Dr. Torres? Suddenly, I remembered the videos. Over the past 3 years, I had regularly documented Mom's condition, initially as reference for her doctors, then as a way to preserve the few lucid moments we still had. I grabbed my tablet and began searching through the files from 8 months ago. And there it was. March 16th, the day Patricia mentioned, filmed in the morning, before I left for my hospital shift. The video showed Mom clearly confused, unable to recognize where she was, repeatedly asking for my father. At one point, she looked directly at the camera and asked, "Are you the new nurse?" There was also a video from the next day, March 17th, when she had a rare moment of clarity. That's when she said, explicitly, "Julia, you'll get the house when I'm gone. Lucas has the apartment we helped him buy." The contradiction couldn't have been clearer. How could she, in sound mind, sign a will disinheriting me one day, and the next day clearly state I would get the house? I searched for the oldest video I had, from about 2 years ago, when Mom still had long periods of lucidity. In it, we were sitting in the garden, and she said clearly, "When I'm gone, the house will be yours, Julia. You always took care of it, and of me, better than anyone. Lucas is well off with his apartment in St. Paul. This was always more your home than his anyway." With trembling hands, I connected the tablet to my laptop and backed up all the videos. If there was a chance to contest the will, these would be crucial. The next morning, I called Angela, my ex-sister-in-law. Although our relationship mostly revolved around Bobby, we had always maintained a mutual respect that survived her rocky divorce from Lucas. "Julia? Is everything okay?" she answered, clearly surprised by my call. "Actually, no," I replied honestly. "Do you have a few minutes? I need some perspective." We met at a cafe halfway between our homes. Angela, always direct, listened without interruption, as I recounted the recent events. "I'm not the least bit surprised," she said when I finished, a flash of anger crossing her usually composed face. "Lucas has always been great at manipulating situations to his advantage. That's why our divorce was so complicated." She paused, fiddling with her coffee spoon. "There's something you should know. When we were separating, Lucas tried to get Bobby, who was only 6 at the time, to sign some papers. He told him it was a drawing for the judge. I found out. Later it was a statement saying I was negligent. I was horrified. How did you find out? Bobby told me. He couldn't read everything, but he recognized my name on the document and asked why the paper said bad things about me. A chill ran through me. Do you think he could manipulate Mom the same way? Angela looked me straight in the eye. Julia, Lucas would do anything for money, anything. She paused again, considering something. Bobby was with him on that visit in March. Lucas said it was a special day with Grandma. Maybe Bobby saw or heard something. The thought of involving Bobby in this conflict made me deeply uncomfortable. But if he had witnessed something important, I don't want to drag him into this, I said finally. Neither do I, Angela agreed. But maybe we could just ask him what he remembers about that day. No pressure, no leading questions. 2 cups of coffee later, we had a plan. Angela agreed to casually ask Bobby about the visit, without mentioning the will or any disputes. She also gave me the name of an attorney who specialized in inheritance conflicts, Christopher Morgan, who had represented a friend of hers in a similar case. It won't be easy, she warned as we said goodbye. Lucas will fight with everything he's got, and he has connections, money stashed away. How can he have money stashed away? I asked, confused. He's always asking for loans. Angela gave a humorless smile. That's his game, always pretending to need help while hoarding money in separate accounts. I found 3 of them during the divorce. That afternoon, I called Dr. Torres, the neurologist who had treated my mother during the past few years. Her assistant was initially hesitant to book an appointment since the patient had passed away, but once I explained the situation, I was given a slot for the next day. Dr. Torres welcomed me into her office, her hands folded on the desk, a grave expression on her face as I explained everything. This is deeply troubling, Julia, she said when I finished. Based on my regular evaluations, your mother was definitely not capable of understanding or signing complex legal documents for at least the past 2 years. Can you document that officially? For a possible legal case? Absolutely. I have detailed records of every visit, cognitive tests, and my professional observations. I can also testify in person if needed. She hesitated, then added, I should mention, your brother called here last week requesting copies of your mother's medical records. Since he didn't have medical power of attorney, you did, we didn't release anything. That detail alarmed me. Lucas was clearly gearing up for a fight. One more thing, Dr. Torres added. Your mother often expressed concern about Lucas during our appointments, even on her most confused days. She used to say he always needed saving from himself, but that this time, you should be the priority. Left the office with a lump in my throat and a folder containing official documentation of my mother's cognitive impairment. The next step was clear. I needed legal representation. Christopher Morgan had a small office downtown, unassuming but meticulously organized. At 42, he had a reputation for being relentless in family disputes, especially those involving vulnerable elderly individuals. Your case is compelling, he said after reviewing the medical records and watching some of the videos. The contradiction between the contents of the will and your mother's clearly recorded statements just days before is particularly significant. So, we have a chance? I asked, a flicker of hope surfacing. Yes, but it won't be easy or quick, he warned. Properly signed wills carry strong legal protections, even when mental capacity is in question. Your brother hired Martin Graves as his attorney. He's known for aggressive tactics and dragging cases out indefinitely. How do you know who he hired? I asked, surprised. Christopher gave a slight smile. Because Graves has already reached out, offering a settlement. They know you're considering contesting the will. I froze. How could they know that? Someone must have informed your brother about your recent conversations. Maybe Dr. Torres's office or someone close to me, I finished, suspicion spreading like an oil stain. Suspicion is a terrible thing. Once planted, it grows like a weed, choking the trust that once existed. On the way home from Christopher's office, I replayed every recent conversation in my head. Who could have told Lucas about my plans? Patricia was loyal to the end. Angela had despised Lucas since the divorce. Dr. Torres was bound by medical confidentiality. The answer hit me as I parked the car. The lawyer's secretary. When I called to schedule the consultation with Christopher Morgan, I briefly mentioned the reason. One quick call to Lucas would have been enough. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of legal activity and emotional preparation. Christopher drafted the formal will contest based on testamentary incapacity, the legal claim that my mother wasn't mentally competent when she signed the document. Meanwhile, following Lucas's request, I reluctantly started packing. My things. I had no intention of leaving, but I wanted to appear cooperative while we built our case. Each day brought a new disturbing revelation. Angela called after casually chatting with Bobby about the March visit to Grandma. He said something. Interesting, she reported, her voice low. Apparently, Lucas and Betty had an argument that day. Bobby was playing video games in the bedroom, but he heard his dad raising his voice, saying she had promised, and that it was the right thing to do after everything he'd been through. Did he hear her response? Not clearly, but he said she sounded confused and upset. At one point, he heard Lucas say something like, "Just sign here, Mom. We've already talked about this." That information, though valuable, posed a moral dilemma. Using a 9-year-old's testimony against his own father could traumatize Bobby. After consulting with Christopher and a child psychologist, we decided not to formally include Bobby in our case, to protect him from further emotional stress. Instead, we focused on 3 pillars of evidence: the medical records and testimony from Dr. Torres II, the videos documenting my mother's mental condition, the pattern of Lucas's sporadic visits versus my continuous caregiving. Patricia also agreed to testify about the years I devoted to caring for my mother and about Betty's obvious confusion on the day she supposedly signed the will. The first hearing was scheduled for January, 4 months after my mother's death. Christopher explained that it would be a preliminary one, just to determine whether there was enough merit to move forward with a full trial. As the date approached, Lucas ramped up the pressure for me to vacate the house. I started finding friendly reminder notes in the mailbox, then a formal eviction notice. He's bluffing, Christopher assured me. He can't legally evict you while the will contest is still pending. It's just an intimidation tactic. But the intimidation was working. I started finding Lucas inspecting the property when I got home from work. He would show up, unannounced, walking around the yard, measuring rooms, even bringing an interior designer once. Just planning a few upgrades, he said casually when I confronted him. Tiffany has a great eye. This house is in desperate need of a refresh. The house my mother had lovingly maintained for decades. The house where every detail had been chosen with care and intention. One night, I came back from the hospital to find the front door lock had been changed. I had to call an emergency locksmith, spending money I could barely spare. It must have been a misunderstanding, Lucas said innocently when I called him, furious. The locksmith must have come on the wrong day. I was planning to give you a copy of the new key, of course. Each provocation was carefully calculated to seem reasonable to outsiders, while making me increasingly stressed. He was trying to wear me down into giving up. An unexpected twist came when Angela called me at 3 a.m., her voice tense. He came into my apartment, she said without preamble. Lucas, while Bobby and I were sleeping. I sat up in bed, instantly alert. What? Are you okay? Is Bobby okay? We're physically fine but shaken. I woke up to a noise and found him in the office, rummaging through my files. He said he was picking up some documents of Bobby's he left here, but that's a lie. He doesn't have anything here. Did you call the police? Yes. They filed a report, but since we have shared custody of Bobby and Lucas still legally has a key, they considered it a domestic misunderstanding. Something dawned on Angela, and her voice became more urgent. Julia, if he's going through my files, he might be looking for evidence. You said you made copies of the videos, right? Where are they stored? My blood ran cold. The main copies were on my laptop and on a flash drive I kept with me, but the originals, on my tablet, at the house. You need to protect that. Evidence. Now. I ran to the second bedroom, where I kept my electronics. The tablet wasn't in its usual drawer. I frantically searched the entire apartment, growing more and more desperate. It was gone. I called Christopher immediately, not caring about the time. He stole the evidence, I said as soon as he picked up, my voice choked with panic. Lucas took my tablet with the original videos. Thankfully, the copies on my laptop and flash drive were safe. Christopher instructed me to upload the files to cloud storage immediately and bring him the flash drive in the morning. This is actually good for us, he noted surprisingly. Stealing evidence is a serious ethical violation and potentially criminal. We'll add this to our petition and request a court order for the return of the device. The next morning, I handed the flash drive to Christopher, as agreed. While driving to the hospital, I got a call from an unknown number. Julia? A young male voice, hesitant. This is Ryan from the hospital's IT department. I've got a bit of a weird situation here. My stomach sank. What happened? A man was here earlier, claiming to be your brother. He was trying to access your work email, said you forgot to send an important family document and he was just trying to help. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my fingers turned white. Did he get access? No, our policy doesn't allow access to employee accounts without express authorization and proper ID. But I thought you should know. Lucas was getting desperate, and therefore more dangerous. That night, I sat in the small apartment I'd rented temporarily, surrounded by half-open boxes and displaced memories. The feeling of violation ran deep, not just from the potential loss of the house, but from the way Lucas was methodically trying to erase any trace of his behavior. My phone rang. It was Christopher. We have a date for the preliminary hearing, he said. Monday, 10 a.m. And Julia, I have some troubling news. I closed my eyes, exhausted by yet another negative surprise. What now? Martin Graves submitted a motion claiming the videos you recorded violate privacy laws, arguing that your mother wasn't in a condition to consent to being filmed. They're trying to have them thrown out as evidence. That's ridiculous. I made those videos as her caregiver, to document her condition for the doctors. I know, and we have solid counter-arguments, but it shows they're worried about what's in those videos. When I hung up, I noticed I had a voicemail from an unknown number. It was Tiffany, Lucas's girlfriend. Julia, I know we don't really know each other, but I need to tell you something. Lucas doesn't know I'm calling. Please meet. Meet tomorrow at Lakeside Cafe at 9. It's important. I stared at the phone, torn between caution and curiosity. It could be a trap. Or it could be exactly what we needed. I decided to hear what she had to say. Lakeside Cafe was a cozy spot by the lake where my mom and I used to drink hot chocolate on Sundays, before her illness worsened. I arrived 20 minutes early, choosing a table with a clear view of the entrance and exits. Years of caring for pediatric patients had taught me to always have an escape plan in potentially volatile situations. Tiffany arrived promptly at 9, looking significantly more nervous than she had at the lawyer's office. She wore jeans and a plain sweater, very different from the polished image she had previously presented. Her eyes scanned the entire cafe before she sat down. "Thanks for coming," she said softly. "I don't have much time. Lucas thinks I'm at a Pilates class." "Why did you want to see me?" I asked directly. She took a deep breath, clearly summoning courage. "Lucas isn't who you think he is. Or maybe he's exactly who you think he is. I don't even know anymore." I stayed silent, waiting for her to go on. "We've only been together for 4 months," she explained. "Everything happened really fast. He's charming, persuasive. He said he was about to inherit a significant family estate, that we could start a new life together." A waitress approached. Tiffany ordered just coffee, her hands trembling slightly. At first, I thought it was sweet how much he talked about taking care of his sick mom, how he was the only one she really trusted in the end. She paused. Then I started noticing inconsistencies, strange messages, secret calls. "When did you find out the truth about the situation?" I asked. "Little by little. First, I found out he rarely visited his mom, despite saying otherwise. Then I found documents in his apartment, drafts of wills, notes on how to secure the signature." She swallowed hard. "When I confronted Lucas, he said he was just making sure his mom's wishes were respected." The waitress brought the coffee. Tiffany waited until she walked away before continuing. "The day before yesterday, I overheard a conversation between him and Martin. They were discussing how to deal with the tablet problem, the videos. Lucas said he had taken care of it and that you would never find the originals." "Did he confess to stealing my tablet?" "Not explicitly, but it was clear he knew exactly where the evidence was, the kind that could incriminate him." She hesitated, then said, "There's more. The night your mother passed away, Lucas was with me. He got a phone call, presumably from Patricia. His reaction was disturbing." "What do you mean?" He smiled, not briefly, not out of shock. A genuine smile of relief, followed by a comment, "We can finally move forward." My stomach turned. Even knowing what kind of person Lucas was, hearing that he celebrated our mother's death was nauseating. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, part of me still suspecting some elaborate setup. "Because last night he casually mentioned he was handling you the same way he did with his ex-wife during their divorce. When I asked what that meant, he laughed and said Angela learned not to interfere after he visited her apartment." Tiffany lowered her voice. The way he talked about it scared me. She opened her bag and pulled out a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "I found this in his closet." I unwrapped the paper and found a yellow flash drive I instantly recognized. The original backup of the videos, the one I thought was safely with Christopher. "How?" "I don't know how he got it, but it was hidden among his things. I copied everything before bringing it to you. If he finds out I took it..." "Why risk this for me?" I asked, genuinely confused. "You barely know me." Tiffany looked out the window toward the lake. "My grandmother had Alzheimer's. I saw how people can be manipulated when they're vulnerable. What Lucas did. She shook her head. I can't be part of that. She checked the time and stood up abruptly. I have to go, and Julia, be careful. I don't think he's expecting to lose. After she left, I sat for a long time, the flash drive clenched in my hand. Tiffany could be telling the truth, or this could all be part of some elaborate scheme orchestrated by Lucas. There was no way to know for sure. I called Christopher immediately and told him about the conversation. Bring the flash drive to the office now, he instructed. If it's authentic, we need to carefully verify the chain of custody to make it admissible. At Christopher's office, an IT expert analyzed the contents of the flash drive. It was indeed my original videos, including some I didn't even remember recording. This is much bigger than we initially thought, Christopher remarked as he watched the analysis. If your brother stole evidence from my office, we're talking about serious ethical violations, possibly criminal. How could he even get into your office? I asked. That's the part that worries me. Someone here must have helped him. That afternoon, Christopher filed an emergency motion to secure the evidence and request sanctions against Lucas and possibly Martin Graves for unethical conduct. The next day, when I arrived at the hospital for my shift, I was called to the administration office. Linda Hoffman, the director of nursing for 20 years, greeted me with a concerned expression. Julia, we had a rather unusual situation this morning. Your brother came by demanding information about your employment history, claiming concerns about your mental capacity for an ongoing legal case. I froze. What? Obviously, we didn't provide any information, but he made some disturbing accusations, said you falsified care records, that you have a history of emotional instability. She leaned forward. Julia, I've known your work for years. I know that's nonsense, but I want you to be aware. He's trying to undermine your professional credibility. Lucas's strategy was clear now. If he couldn't destroy the physical evidence, he'd try to destroy the witness. That night at home, I returned to find my temporary apartment completely ransacked. Drawers pulled out, papers scattered, even the mattress flipped. Nothing valuable had been taken, but the message was clear: you're not safe. I called the police, who filed it as a home invasion, but with no signs of forced entry and nothing stolen, there was little they could do. The following days brought more subtle attacks. I got phone calls with nothing but silence on the other end. I found my tires mysteriously deflated. An anonymous tip was submitted to the hospital administration, accusing me of stealing medications, a claim that was quickly dismissed after investigation. He's desperate, Christopher observed when I told him about it. Which means we're in a stronger position than he expected. The preliminary hearing was set for the following Monday, just 3 days away. Patricia called on a Friday night, her voice tight with urgency. Julia, I stopped by the house to pick up some flower seeds Betty had saved for me. The lights are on, and I see someone moving inside. Lucas, I replied immediately. He has keys now. He's probably continuing with his renovation plans despite the case. It's not Lucas, Patricia said, her voice dropping to a whisper. It's a man I've never seen before. He's wearing gloves and seems to be searching for something in the walls. Call the police right now, I instructed, already grabbing my keys. I'm on my way, but don't go near the house. I drove well above the speed limit, heart pounding. What had Lucas done now? Hired someone to plant or remove something from the house? When I arrived, 2 police cruisers were already parked out front, their lights flashing silently. Patricia stood on the sidewalk speaking to an officer. They got him, she said as I approached. He was trying to install some kind of devices in the walls. Cameras or microphones, they think. The officer confirmed. We found surveillance, equipment in his possession, along with installation tools. He initially claimed he was hired for home security, but he had no documentation. Did he say who hired him? I asked, already knowing the answer. He's exercising his right to remain silent, the officer replied. But we found text messages on his phone, apparently from your brother, with specific instructions on where to place the devices. Finally, a concrete mistake from Lucas. something even the police couldn't ignore. That night, I slept on Patricia's couch, unable to return to my violated apartment or the house that technically wasn't mine anymore. The preliminary hearing was just 2 days away, and Lucas had escalated to increasingly desperate tactics. On Sunday, I got an unexpected call from Angela. "Bobby wants to talk to you," she said without preamble. "He's insisting. It's important." Aya. Moment later, my nephew's voice came through the line, unusually serious for his 9 years. "Aunt Julia, do you remember when Dad and I visited Grandma that day the man in the suit came?" "Yes, Bobby, I remember. I recorded some of that on my Nintendo Switch." His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Dad was arguing with Grandma and she was crying. It seemed important, so I pressed the record button." My heart nearly stopped. "Do you still have that recording?" "Yes. Mom's going to send it to you now. I didn't tell Dad." Minutes. Later, I received a video in my email. The quality was poor, typical for a gaming device, but the audio was clear enough. It showed part of my mother sitting in her armchair, visibly confused and distressed. Lucas's voice was perfectly audible. "Just sign here, Mom. We've already talked about this. Julia doesn't need the house. She has plenty of money. I need it more. You've always known that." "I don't understand." My mother's fragile voice responded. "Where's Julia? I want to talk to Julia first." She already agreed to this. Lucas lied smoothly. "She understands it's what's best for everyone. Just sign. Here, let me guide your hand." The video ended abruptly, but it was more than enough. "Bobby's a genius," I murmured to myself, tears welling in my eyes. I called Christopher immediately. His response was unequivocal. "This changes everything. We're beyond will contestation now. This is clear evidence of fraud." The next morning, as I was getting ready for court, I received a text message from an unknown number. "Tiffany's in the hospital. Lucas found out. Be careful." The Hennepin County Courthouse was an imposing granite and glass building, its marble halls echoing with hurried footsteps and hushed voices. I arrived an hour early, Christopher by my side, both of us carrying thick folders of meticulously organized evidence. "I'm going to check with the hospital about Tiffany," I murmured as we made our way to the assigned room. That message has me worried. "Focus on the hearing first," Christopher advised, though his own expression showed concern. "We can't let this distract us now." In the anteroom, we found Patricia and Angela, who had brought the original Nintendo Switch recording from Bobby. Dr. Torres arrived shortly after, bringing my mother's complete medical records. "Lucas is already here," Angela said quietly. "He's in the conference room at the end of the hallway with Martin Graves, and there's someone else with them, a man I've never seen before. Probably an expert witness they'll use to challenge the video's validity," Christopher speculated. The minutes dragged as we waited. I watched the doors, half expecting Lucas to appear with some new intimidation tactic. Instead, I saw the bailiff enter the courtroom in a hurry, followed by a judicial assistant with a grim expression. At 10:15, we were finally called in. The courtroom wasn't like those on TV dramas. It was smaller, more austere, dominated by a large wooden table where Judge Harmon, a man in his 60s with impressively thick eyebrows, was already seated. Lucas and Martin Graves entered from the opposite side of the room, followed by a man in a gray suit carrying a tablet. My brother looked at me briefly, his face a mask of confidence that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Before we begin formal proceedings," Judge Harmon started, flipping through some documents, "I must inform you that I've received disturbing notifications within the last 24 hours. He looked up, his eyes scanning the room. "I've been informed of allegations involving evidence theft, witness intimidation, and potential criminal conduct related to this case. Normally, these would be addressed separately, but given the interconnected nature of the claims, I believe it is prudent to address them now." I saw Lucas straighten in his chair, his face suddenly tense. "Mr. Graves," the judge continued, The court has received a formal complaint from the district attorney's office regarding possible obstruction of justice involving your client. Were you aware of this? Martin Graves looked momentarily puzzled. No, Your Honor. This is the first I'm hearing of such a complaint. And what about the attempted trespassing and installation of surveillance devices on the disputed property? Is that news to you as well? Graves shot a quick, piercing glance at Lucas, who kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. Absolutely, Your Honor. If such allegations exist, my client categorically denies any involvement. The judge flipped through a few more documents. I've also received a police report concerning one Miss Tiffany Lawrence, currently hospitalized with a broken wrist and facial bruising, following what she described as an altercation with Mr. Winters related to this case. Would you care to comment, Mr. Graves? The entire courtroom seemed to freeze. My heart tightened at the thought of Tiffany. She had taken a risk to help me and had paid the price. Graves appeared genuinely stunned. He turned to Lucas, who shook his head in silent denial. Your Honor, we are not aware of any such incident. If Miss Lawrence has suffered some accident, my client expresses his concern, but denies any involvement. Judge Harmon removed his glasses, staring directly at Lucas. Mr. Winters, I normally wouldn't address criminal matters in a preliminary civil hearing. However, when I receive information suggesting that one party may be systematically attempting to corrupt the legal process, it becomes my responsibility to act. Lucas finally spoke, his voice adopting the calm, reasonable tone I knew all too well. Your Honor, I am just as disturbed by these allegations as you are. I fear my sister, in her grief and disappointment, has resorted to extreme tactics to tarnish my reputation. The audacity of his claim left me momentarily speechless. Christopher placed a steadying hand on my arm, a silent reminder to remain composed. I have proof, I declared, my voice steadier than I expected. Not only of video footage showing my mother's condition, but of Mr. Winters' deliberate manipulation to force her into signing documents she didn't understand. The judge nodded. Yes, we've reviewed the preliminary evidence submitted by both parties. Mr. Morgan, I understand you have additional materials not included in the initial filing? Christopher stood. Yes, Your Honor. We received crucial evidence within the last 48 hours that conclusively demonstrates Elizabeth Winters was not only unfit to sign a legally binding will, but was actively coerced by Mr. Winters. Lucas leaned in to whisper urgently to his attorney, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Permission to present Exhibit 12B, Your Honor, Christopher continued. A video dated March 18th, one day after the alleged signing of the contested will. The judge gave a brief nod, and Christopher set up the exhibit. The lights in the courtroom dimmed slightly as a screen lowered behind the witness stand. My mother's face filled the screen, her blue eyes clouded by dementia, yet still unmistakably hers. In the video, she appeared confused about where she was repeatedly asking for my father, who had long since passed. And then came the pivotal moment we had highlighted, a rare moment of clarity in which she explicitly said, Julia, you're going to have the house when I'm gone. I promised your father I'd take care of you, and you've taken such good care of me. Lucas has the apartment we helped him buy. He was never good with money, always needed more. But you built your own path. The house is your promise. The video ended. The silence in the room was palpable. Martin Graves was scribbling furiously on his notepad, while Lucas maintained a carefully neutral expression, though I could see a vein pulsing at his temple. Your Honor. Graves finally spoke. While emotional, this video does not necessarily contradict the legal will. People with dementia often become confused about recently made decisions. The signed will represents Mrs. Winters' genuine intent during a moment of mental clarity. We have one more exhibit, Your Honor, Christopher replied. This one was recorded by an independent underage witness on the exact day of the alleged signing. Bobby's Nintendo Switch video began to play. Despite the lower quality, the content was undeniable. Lucas pressuring our clearly confused mother, guiding her hand to sign, falsely claiming I had agreed to the arrangement. As the court can see, Christopher stated as the video ended. This is not just a matter of questionable mental capacity, but of deliberate fraud and coercion. Lucas had gone pale now, his eyes darting frantically between his lawyer and the judge. Graves looked equally shaken, clearly unaware of the recording's existence. "Mr. Graves," Judge Harmon said in a grave tone, "were you aware of this specific interaction before taking on this case?" Graves hesitated, clearly weighing his options. His reputation and law license were potentially at stake. "No, Your Honor," he finally responded. "I was not aware of this particular video or the exact circumstances of the signing, as shown." Lucas stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous. That video's been doctored, clearly. My nephew was coached to—" "Mr. Winters," the judge interrupted firmly. "I advise you to remain seated and let your attorney speak on your behalf." Lucas sat down, his face now a mask of barely contained rage. "I've seen many disputes in my years on the bench," the judge continued. "Rarely have I encountered such clear evidence of deliberate manipulation. In light of what has been presented today, I am inclined to immediately invalidate the contested will rather than proceed with a full trial that would only prolong this unfortunate situation." He looked directly at me for the first time. "Ms. Winters, the court recognizes the extensive care you provided your mother during her illness, as well as the substantial evidence that your mother, in moments of clarity, consistently expressed her desire for the property to be yours." Lucas began to protest again, but Graves placed a hand on his arm, silencing him. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I am referring the evidence of potential criminal conduct to the district attorney for investigation. This includes allegations of evidence tampering, unlawful entry, witness intimidation, and the incident involving Ms. Lawrence." He struck the gavel once, the sound echoing through the silent courtroom. "The will dated March 16th is hereby officially invalidated. The property and assets of Elizabeth Winters shall be distributed according to her previous will, dated 8 years ago, which divided her estate equally between her children. However," he added, looking directly at Lucas, "any funds used by Mr. Winters for the purchase of the vehicle identified in the records, and any other personal expenses made using the deceased's money after the date of the fraudulent will shall be deducted from his share." Across the room, Lucas stood up again, his face twisted with rage. "This is outrageous! I'm going to appeal!" "You can't, Mr. Winters," the judge interrupted sharply. "One more word, and I'll hold you in contempt. This hearing is adjourned." And just like that, in under an hour, a battle I feared might last for years was over. As we gathered our things, I saw Lucas storm out of the courtroom, ignoring his own attorney's attempts to stop him. On the courthouse steps, Patricia hugged me tightly. "Betty would be so proud," she whispered. "You fought for the truth, not just for a house." Angela nodded, her arm around my shoulders. "Bobby's going to be so relieved. He was really worried he had caused trouble." "He's a hero," I replied sincerely. Without his recording, this could have dragged on forever. Christopher walked over, tucking some documents into his briefcase. "An excellent outcome, though I never could have predicted how we'd get here. You know this isn't completely over, right? Lucas is facing potential criminal charges, and you'll likely have to testify." I nodded, feeling a strange lightness despite the seriousness of it all. "I'm ready for that. The truth matters." My first stop after court was the hospital, where Tiffany was recovering. Her bruised face turned even paler when I walked into the room. "He found out about the flash drive," she said quietly. "He just changed. I'd never seen him like that before." "I'm so sorry you got pulled into this," I said, truly guilty for her pain. She shook her head. "Don't be. I finally saw who he really is. Better now than years down the line, like Angela." Holding her uninjured hand, I told her about the hearing's outcome. A small smile crossed her battered face. "Then it was worth it," she said simply. 3 days later, I returned to the house, now legally mine. It looked exactly as I'd left it in a rush weeks earlier, with one notable exception. The missing tablet was sitting on the kitchen table, with a simple note attached. "Found during cleaning. returning to rightful owner. Monsieur Graves. Apparently, even ambitious lawyers have limits to what they'll tolerate from dishonest clients. Lucas was formally charged with fraud, witness intimidation, and assault 1 week later. When news of his actions spread, he lost his job at the insurance agency. Last I heard, he'd moved to another state, presumably to start over where his reputation didn't follow him. Brandon continued to visit regularly, our bond strengthened by everything we'd been through. He showed genuine interest in learning photography, a hobby my mother and I had shared, and we spent warm afternoons exploring her old camera collection. 6 months after the hearing, I hosted a small gathering in the garden my mother had loved so much. Patricia was there, of course, along with Dr. Torres, Angela and Bobby, Christopher, and a few close colleagues from the hospital. In the center of the garden, we placed a small memorial bench with a simple plaque. Elizabeth Betty Winters, teacher, mother, friend. Her clarity of heart outshone the fog of the mind. As everyone shared memories and stories, Bobby quietly approached, holding something in his hands. "I found this among Grandma's things," he said, handing me a small photo album I had never seen before. It was in a box in the attic when Mom and I were helping organize. I opened the album carefully. On the first page was a photo of my mother when she was young, holding a baby I recognized as myself, with my father beside her. The caption, written in the flawless handwriting she had before the illness, read, "Our little Julia, the strength of our family." The following pages held a visual timeline I had never seen before. Me learning to walk, Lucas and I playing, in the backyard, teenage moments, my graduation from nursing school. The final page contained a more recent photo, me by my mother's bedside, both of us smiling at the camera during one of her good days. The caption simply read, "My caregiver, my daughter, my hero." The tears I had held back during the trial, through the fight, and throughout the long months of turmoil, finally came. Not from sorrow, but from a deep sense of validation. Mom knew. Even through the fog of dementia, she knew who I was and what I meant to her. "Thank you, Bobby," I whispered, hugging my nephew. He smiled, that innocent 9-year-old smile that seemed to light up the world. "Grandma knew you loved her more than anything. She told me in our secret." "What secret?" I asked, curious. On the days she was confused, I pretended to be a spy on a secret mission. She loved it and played along. It was our game. His eyes lit up with the memory. One time she told me, "Agent Bobby, I have an important secret. Julia is the keeper of the treasures of the heart. She takes care of everything that matters. Never forget that." Patricia approached, having overheard our conversation. Betty had a special clarity about people, even when she was confused about everything else. She always knew who truly cared. That night, after everyone had left, I sat on the porch with the photo album in my lap. The house around me was more than just wood and concrete. It was a vault of memories, some painful, many precious. I decided that part of the house would become a small support center for dementia caregivers. The Elizabeth Winters Foundation would offer resources, support groups, and most importantly, a space where caregivers could find moments of peace and understanding. "Your brother needs it more." The words that had hurt me so deeply in the boss, fraudulent will now felt ironic. Lucas, in his greed and manipulation, had revealed himself as truly needy, not for money or property, but for something far more essential: integrity, compassion, the ability to love unconditionally. I hadn't just inherited a house. I had inherited the opportunity to turn pain into purpose, betrayal into growth, and loss into legacy. When my mother excluded me from the will with the words, "Your brother needs it more," she never imagined that a short video would reveal the truth behind that phrase. Those weren't her true words, but the manipulation of a son who preyed on her vulnerability. In court, when I revealed not just one video, but many, including an unlikely recording made by a 9-year-old with a gaming console, the truth finally prevailed. The video changed everything. But what truly mattered wasn't the footage itself, but what it represented, that even in the most unjust circumstances, the truth finds a way to emerge. Standing on the porch, Watching the sunset over the garden my mother loved so much, I finally understood that the real inheritance was never at risk. My mother's love, her courage, her integrity. Those lived on in me, a testament no forged document could ever erase.